Todd, the Vice President of Corporate Communications for Loctite. It is my distinct honor to bring you this video. At this crossroads in the company's history, David Freeman and I feel it is appropriate to share with you the Loctite story. The program is the first in a series called The Entrepreneurs, which originally aired on WTIC-TV, Hartford Fox affiliate. The Entrepreneurs is a series of half-hour documentaries about successful Connecticut companies. The stories are told by and about people who turn good ideas into achievements. People like Loctite's founders, Vernon and Bob Krieble, a father and son chemistry team who set out to solve the unsolvable and didn't stop until they built a Fortune 500 company. With assistance from many of the people who helped build Loctite into an international success story, we feel we have captured the entrepreneurial spirit the company was founded on. The principles of hard work, perseverance, innovation, and dedication that are the hallmarks of Loctite. Keeping the Krieble's entrepreneurial spirit alive, as Loctite employees do each and every day through their hard work, is the greatest way in which we can honor them. We dedicate this production to Bob, who passed away in May of 1997. Thanks to him, this story belongs to all of us. We hope you enjoy The Entrepreneurs, the history of Loctite.
Throw it on the floor, or they would slam it against the wall, and if it stayed together, they said, wow.
At 11:30 in the morning, I got a call from a very tearful kindergarten teacher who said she had 23 kids running around with their fingers all stuck together. What was she going to do now?
There was something magic about what they were trying to do and how they were trying to do it.
The company should never have been created.
The problem Professor Krieble was dealing with was keeping a monomer from forming a polymer. He found a chemical that, in the presence of the monomer, would react with some additional molecules to form the adhesive, which is now called Loctite.
It was 1920, and a small New England college was looking to bolster its chemistry department. Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, conducted a national search to find someone who would raise the department to national prominence. They called on a chemist named Vernon Krieble.
Vernon was actually hired by Trinity College in 1920 to revitalize the chemistry department. Vernon very clearly thought that chemistry was important. Perhaps you didn't have to be literate in the subject, but you should certainly have a significant awareness of the impact of chemistry on your daily lives. And he made sure that the students in his classes and all of the courses that were taught in this department had a significant component of just what that awareness was.
Sweeping changes were made at Trinity in just a few short years, as Vernon Krieble made his mark quickly as a dedicated chemist, an inspiring teacher, and a skilled administrator. One night while Vernon and his wife were chaperoning a dance, he met a student named Hugh Campbell. It was a relationship that would last for many years.
I got to know him early on, and I'd go up to his house on Vernon Street and spend an evening with him. He had a cow. That was part of the stipend. And he had a great sense of humor. When he came to work, I think he came for $3,000 a year. And he realized after he got here that a lot of the faculty had independent means, independent incomes, wholly apart from their salary. He figured, I got to get a hold of some of that. And he became an investor.
His keen eye for investing enabled Vernon to gain insight into the business world, and the extra income allowed him to live comfortably in Hartford and raise his family. The family's legacy of chemistry lived on in his son Bob, who was also a chemist and an inventor in the private sector.
Bob was the head of research at General Electric, was in the process of developing what they hoped would be an adhesive, a glue, if you will, that would cure in the absence of oxygen for the purpose of maintaining mechanical structures that were subjected to loosening by vibrations and other motions.
But Bob and GE couldn't make it work. Shipping was nearly impossible, since the material had to be connected to an air compressor in order to keep it stable. When Bob proposed shipping it in an oil can with a fish tank aerator strapped to the side, his bosses looked at him like he was crazy. Bob knew his father would love a scientific challenge like this.
At that point, Bob suggested then that Vernon perhaps think about the solution and see if he could dabble in the laboratory and come up with a solution. So he literally turned over the entire project to Vernon with very little hope that anything was going to come of it.
That's not what Vernon had in mind. It took a while, but he found the chemical part of the solution. And then one day, he saw how to solve the physical problem. For the first time ever, a company in Hartford was making breathable plastic bottles.
And so he immediately set out to secure a supply of these polyethylene bottles, to add his Loctite material to it, about approximately half filling each bottle, sealing them, and then waiting to see what happened. And a week went by, nothing happened. It stayed liquid. A month went by, nothing happened. It stayed liquid. A year went by, nothing happened, and it stayed liquid. And it was at that point that he achieved what we all would like to achieve at some point in our life, the so-called eureka experience. I have found it. This is the magic that's going to allow this particular product to be commercialized.
What exactly did Vernon discover? An adhesive that could be stored easily in liquid form, but would harden in the absence of air. It could fill up those inner spaces inevitable in even the most closely fitted metal parts, like nuts and bolts. It was the seal of success for the chemist and the birth of a new product to be called Loctite Adhesive Sealant. The next challenge was to find a market for the product. Now it was Vernon's turn to call on his son Bob for his business sense. But would Bob risk his successful career at GE to take a chance on the unknown?
In kind of a boyish way, I'm sure that he sensed that, well, I'm going to take the plunge and give up my secure position at General Electric and try and make this thing work. But I'm sure that in part, that decision had to be based on kind of a devil-may-care attitude. You know, let's do it, let's go for it and see if it happens, and if it doesn't, we'll be okay anyway.
But the idea was only the first step. The Kriebles still needed applications. They needed money. They needed believers. So Vernon turned to a handful of Trinity graduates to enlist their financial support. His old friend Hugh Campbell was curious.
The way I got into it was a friend of mine named Oliver Johnson. He invited me to come up to Trinity and see Krieble. He took us into a dinky little laboratory that the college had given him when he retired. He pulled out a desk drawer that was full of nuts and bolts. The nuts were still on the shaft of the bolt, but the bolt was twisted to where it was broken. Now, some of those bolts were 2 inches in diameter. And I said to him, can you graduate the strength of the material that you bond this with? He said, oh, yes, no problem. I said, I want to buy one. And I did.
With financial support from Hugh and others, they raised some seed money. Now they needed customers. They called on the Allen Manufacturing Company in Hartford and spoke to Ellsworth Grant.
Well, I couldn't believe it. And I was fascinated with what they described as this chemical that would harden in the absence of air. And got interested enough, so I said, well, I'd like to show it to our engineering department and see what they think. Well, being mechanical engineers, they all turned it down. They said, this is fantastic, it'll never work, and dropped it. Well, I was interested enough so that I went back to them and I said, you have a new company? Are you selling stock? Well, no, but we're selling bonds. And I said, well, I'd like to have a couple of bonds.
Despite the setbacks, business started to percolate. The company, then known as American Sealants, moved into a one-room office here on Niles Street in Hartford, set up 4 desks, and began looking for a secretary.
I was interviewed with them, and Mr. Krieble told me something about the company, showed me some of the pieces of publicity that they had received and what they were doing, and he pulled out on the arm of his desk and showed me where they were going to be in 10 years. He says, this is where we are now, this is where we're going to be in 10 years. And I was impressed probably in those days more with the people than because it was so new.
In 1956, the company was barely making $1,000 a month in sales, but the Kriebles figured they had something to brag about, so Vernon did something daring.
Professor Krieble called a press conference down in New York, and here there are only 4 employees in the company. They're selling $300 a week of this magic goo. And he has the nerve to call a press conference and invite all of the business scribes and so on. And he was amazed when about 25 of them showed up.
That press party was handled beautifully, and so many people attended that. And then they gave us a strip in each of their monthly publications, and we generated thousands of inquiries.
The word was out, and the orders started pouring in. The fledgling company could hardly keep up. With a staff of 12, the company moved to larger quarters on Hartford's Woodbine Street, and soon after, to a brand new building in Newington.
I was always so glad to see somebody new because we didn't hire somebody unless we really needed them. We were working, we were going crazy, and then we said, okay, it's time to get somebody else.
The somebody else was Bob Carroll, a graduate of the Yale School of Engineering. Carroll was hired for his marketing expertise and engineering knowledge. He became a jewel for the Kriebles, as he was able to communicate visually what they had created scientifically.
No mechanical engineer or assembly engineer had ever studied this in school. And most of them believed either it wouldn't work, or it was a shortcut, or it was a way to cover up mistakes, or, you know, that sort of thing. And it was a difficult sell. It really was.
Carroll suggested they hit the road with a traveling demonstration laboratory. This, combined with trade shows, formed the linchpin of that early communication strategy.
We had a little booth, and we stood there like hucksters. We had a little sample capsule that we made by the thousands. This little capsule of Loctite sealant was one of our best salesmen. And we pressed these into the hands of everybody that walked by, and they looked at them. Some of them paid no attention. Some of them said, well, how does it work?
They saw how it worked, and they started to talk about it. Loctite, it seemed, was gaining ground. But how would they get in the door of potential customers? They knew the need was there. They just needed the right people to convince the right people.
One month I opened the mail and there was a notice that a new product had been invented by Loctite Corporation, and it fit right in with what I was looking for.
Don Carell was one of the company's first advocates of this new technology. He knew who to go to, and the engineers listened.
Hi, Joe. Don Carell. The product itself caused a way of thinking that engineers weren't used to. And it wasn't going in and saying, I've got a product that's better than my competitors, because there weren't any competitors in those days.
Don Carell knew the product was good, but he still couldn't convince the customer. He turned to the creator himself, Vernon, to pay a visit to the chief engineer at Caterpillar.
When Vernon had finished his presentation, the chief engineer said, Dr. Krieble, he says, it sounds like you have a great product, But he says, I don't believe it's for us because we're never going to glue our tractors together. You ought to go down the road to Lawn Boy and sell it to them for their lawnmowers, which I thought was a great idea, but I'd already been down to Lawn Boy and they said, you ought to go to Caterpillar.
3 years later, Caterpillar finally bit, ordering $17,000 worth of Loctite adhesive. It was the company's first big order, and they were rolling.
I'd never met two people before in the same room with the intellect that those two had and the drive they had to succeed. And I looked at the product, and I looked at the Kriebles, and I really bet on the jockeys, because I thought if the Kriebles can't succeed, entrepreneurship is too tough.
Persistence had paid off, and Vernon and Bob Krieble were where they wanted to be, with a commercially viable product that held great hope for future success. On the cusp of that victory, Vernon passed away in 1964. Now on his own, Bob knew the company's success depended on a strong research and development department. He hired chemist Jerry Gorman and engineer Al Toback to explore new and better applications.
Back in the beginning days of Loctite, in the early days of Loctite, one of the things that was very important was your ability to convince the designer or the engineer, the decision maker, that an adhesive joint was strong and it would last. We came up with a demo piece. You can look out in the field and you find the problem areas, and then you come back and you develop a solution for those problems. Then you got a market that's out there already and you know what the market is.
Getting the chemists and the chemical engineers out into the field was critically important because they had to know what the customer was going to do with it. And there are all kinds of strange, unexpected ways in which you can make Loctite go wrong, or any product go wrong, and we want to know what they were.
That's exactly what a bicycle manufacturer in Canada wanted to know.
And so we went down in the back, in the engineering area, and we actually put a bicycle together, frame. And then he said, I want to take this, I want to test it. So I said, okay. So he said, we got to go upstairs. And we went up, and I thought, well, gee, it's strange that the test lab should be upstairs when the engineering facility's downstairs. But we went up on the roof of the building, 4 floors up, and he took the frame and he threw it into the parking lot. And that was the initial test. We went downstairs and he checked all the joints and they were all together. He says, I think we have something here, you know, and then you went further.
The automotive business held the greatest promise with its huge demand for metal fasteners. Too much shake, rattle, and roll, and cars went to the junk heap. Loctite could help, but first the industry had to be convinced to use goo out of a squeeze bottle. The first car maker to express an interest was Ford, but not for the obvious reasons.
It turns out that what Ford, I think, had in mind was they wanted to buy Loctite, but I don't think we saw that at first. But later on, when we saw that, they said, no, look, Loctite's not for sale. We're not about ready to sell Loctite. So that, but at that time, we got a great deal of acceptance in Ford, and they became, I think, our largest user for a while.
It took 7 years, but finally the automotive industry signed on, and Bob's strategy began to pay off. Opportunities emerged everywhere. They figured that if this glue could hold cars together, what about radios and TVs?
Bob pretty well laid out a master plan for what Loctite would become. Loctite started selling overseas even before they crossed the Mississippi. He was determined that at least half of the revenue of Loctite would come from abroad.
We're in the business of applying adhesives, supplying adhesives and sealants for people that manufacture products that every consumer can use, whether it be an electric stove or an automobile or a TV or a VCR. So we need to be in those places where they're going to build all those products, and they don't build them all in the United States. So we expanded very readily overseas. So Loctite looked for a couple of what I call seasoned people to start to develop the business.
One of those seasoned people was Ken Butterworth, chief executive of a large chemical distributor in Australia. He was ordering huge quantities of Loctite. But for what?
this great big order came in from Australia. Mr. Krieble said, "What on earth are they doing with all that Loctite in Australia?" And I said, "Well, you know, it's the country for sheep. Maybe they're using it for a sheep dip, and that red that you see on their backs is now going to be Loctite."
Bob was impressed with Ken Butterworth, enough so that he hired him to head up the international division in 1976, years before the term globalization would become a household word. Loctite International quickly became the company's largest and fastest-growing division. What was its secret?
One of the major reasons for Loctite's growth came from, first of all, starting a business in any country with a distributor. So we'd encourage the distributor to build the business, and then we'd buy him out. So all we were honeybees, just flitting around from one flower to another, pollinating.
It was a strategy that worked. Loctite quickly evolved into a multinational corporation, and its stock price soared. Such success usually breeds competition, but Loctite wasn't worried.
The major competition that we accepted as competition was the traditional ways of doing things. So we ran faster than the competition.
And here, the handle goes right back on the mug, right into place.
And when Loctite couldn't outrun the competition, it simply bought them. Loctite bought Woodhill and leapfrogged into the tantalizing consumer market. It bought Permatex and sped directly into the auto racing business. With these two purchases, Loctite doubled in size seemingly overnight.
All you had to do was put your hand up and say, "Boy, I'll take a shot at that," or "I'll take a risk at that." A lot of risk involved, but I'll call it calculated risk or analytical risk, that, you know, your chances of success were going to be much better than any type of a failure.
But when the recession of the 1970s gripped American business, Loctite too began to struggle. Bob Krieble faced some difficult choices.
We had a crisis, and we were right on the edge of not being able to pay our bills, you know, the company. And Bob assembled all of us in up in the office area, and he said, "I'm going to have to cut everybody's salary 20%." And he was in tears. He was in tears, you know. He says, "I have no choice. So take a day off that you don't have to work," you know. And nobody did that. Everybody pitched in harder. Everybody worked harder.
When we got through the difficult time, he went to the board of directors and said to the board, "I'd like to make up the missing salaries, this one day a week that a number of our people had incurred during that time, by payment to them of stock." And the board said, "Well, isn't this an issue that needs to go to the shareholders?" And Bob said, "No, I'm not talking about stock to be reissued. I'm talking about stock which I personally own."
Worth far more than the 20% that you lost, you know. See, that's the kind, you know, you see what I'm saying? That's the kind of person that he was.
Bob Krieble's steady hand guided the company through that difficult time. Loctite's rebound was impressive. Sales went through the roof. New products sprang to life. New markets offered more opportunities. Once again, Loctite had risen above adversity, ignoring any threats of defeat.
We had 80% of the world's market for the products we were selling. Bob's incredible enthusiasm, his boyish delight in new developments, new technologies. He'd chuckle and jump over the moon if we found some novel way to use the product. And he'd personally walk up to the salesman or the technologist that found that method, and he'd clap them on the back and had a funny way of shaking their hands like this. And he really guided the company through just absolute sheer boyish enthusiasm.
At age 70, Bob decided to retire. He would turn over the reins, along with his hope and enthusiasm for Loctite's continued success, to Ken Butterworth.
When he stepped up to running the the corporation, because we'd been such an entrepreneurial organization, we really didn't have a clear direction as to what a CEO's responsibility is. And in fact, he walked into my office and said, well, I'm CEO now, but I keep asking myself, what are the responsibilities of a CEO?
Ken Butterworth learned the ropes and continued to guide Loctite on a steady course. Bob, who had laid the foundation for all this success, came to Ken with an ironic request.
At the time of handing over to me, he said, there's just one thing I'd like you to do. I have too much money, too much of my personal wealth invested in the company, and I'd like to sell some stock, and I'd like your help.
He wanted a new vision. He wanted to do something different. Now, this missionary spirit was still very evident in his makeup. And he decided that a family-owned business that had become as successful as Loctite could only be sold to another outfit.
Another family-owned outfit, that is. The Henkel Corporation, a German chemical concern, purchased 25% of Loctite stock. This gave Bob the financial freedom he needed to pursue another one of his interests. Just as his father had a passion for the stock market, Bob's passion was politics.
His version of getting into politics was getting involved with what he called the evil empire and trying to bring a democratic government structure to Russia. He would never shrink away from something just because it looked big. He'd just say, how do I go about organizing myself to take on this monster?
While Bob Krieble worked on bringing entrepreneurship to Russia, David Freeman was bringing Loctite to new heights of success.
I'm delighted, ladies and gentlemen, to announce to you that the board of directors named David Freeman President and Chief Executive Officer of the company, and David Freeman is now officially chairman, and I join the rolls of the unemployed.
But while new chapters were beginning, another would come to an end. On November 6, 1996, the Henkel Corporation orchestrated the takeover of the entire company. This marked the end of the company's independence. But what would the future hold?
I think we need to maintain that entrepreneurial spirit if we're going to continue growing Loctite within the Henkel organization. And that's going to come from the freedom to make decisions. We haven't to get bogged down in bureaucracy. We've got to be allowed to make mistakes, learn from those mistakes, correct those mistakes, but recognize that making a majority of right decisions is important. But making decisions is what an entrepreneur is all about.
Bob Krieble knew what being an entrepreneur was all about. He lived it every day. He knew about taking chances, being decisive, and valuing people while never losing sight of his ultimate goal. He knew that enthusiasm and perseverance would defeat pessimism and uncertainty every time. Bob worked long and hard to make Loctite a reality. It was his dream come true. In May 1997, Bob Krieble passed away.
We're going to miss that guy. You know, it's really unfortunate. We're really going to miss him because he was a great, great sounding board. He never forgot about those people that helped him to grow, to make Loctite.
The company should never have existed, and indeed it had every possibility of being stillborn, except for one thing: Bob's incredible enthusiasm.
I remember Mr. Krieble saying, "Don't worry about the port, it's the passage that counts."
He was certainly a classic entrepreneur in the finest tradition of Connecticut Yankee dreamers and doers.